In front of an elf, whose body was covered in bandages, our hero knelt down and with kindness, a kindness she had never felt in her life, he held her hand and promised to heal her. It all began in a village where our protagonist, a pharmacist, had just finished treating a child's knee. The boy, relieved, exclaimed that it didn't hurt anymore. The pharmacist then told him to be careful not to fall again. As they walked away, the two boys waved and thanked him enthusiastically. With a large backpack on his back and a gentle smile, our hero waved back at them. Right after, he turned his attention to a shopping list. While walking, he wondered where to start until a man suddenly called him from a shop door. The man seemed quite relieved to see him. Well, that man was the owner of the pawn shop. So our hero asked if it was his back pain again, but the man denied it. The unexpected answer surprised the pharmacist. The old man then asked him to come in for a moment. Already inside the shop, he said that our hero might find something useful. While opening a back door, he began to explain that an important person had dumped a thing onto him, and so they found a thin person devastated on the floor. That disturbing sight made the pharmacist react in shock. He looked closely at her long pointed ear, which had a hole in it. Her eyes were tired and lifeless. Her body was covered in wounds and scars, crudely bandaged, showing prolonged suffering. That's when the pawnshop owner pointed at her, revealing that this was the so-called problematic thing. He explained that she was an elf who had been exploited to exhaustion, used, and then simply discarded. However, he mentioned that some said an elf's body could be used as an ingredient for a universal remedy, but he admitted he didn't have the right connections for that. With a sadistic smile, the old man pointed at the elf and asked what he thought about it all. Our hero kept his gaze fixed, and although he said nothing, sweat ran down his face. Without hesitating any further, he slowly raised his hand and made the tip of his finger emit a soft glow, thus activating his ability to assess her condition. Upon touching her skin, he noticed her fingers were soft. The gangrene had progressed too far. There were no nails, and whip scars covered her entire body. Soon, his eyes scanned her face and confirmed that her left eye had been gouged out, along with almost all her teeth, leaving only the back molars. With that, our hero asked if she could hear him, while wondering what kind of person could commit such brutality. Observing a faint reaction in the pierced ear, he concluded she could still hear, even with damaged eardrums. With a sharp eye, he assessed the extent of the elf's wounds and quickly concluded that, given the severity, her internal organs likely weren't functioning normally. While reflecting on this, his gaze returned to her face. The weight of responsibility tightened in his chest as he realized that if he didn't treat or protect her, probably no one else would. In silence, he stared at his own reflection in her eyes, and amidst the confusion of emotions, a sincere desire began to grow within him. Without realizing, his eyes widened upon hearing the weak voice echoing from the elf. With effort, and amidst tears, she managed to mutter a few words. And well, her message was simple, but the impact was devastating because between each word, the longing to return home overflowed. Faced with that plea, his eyes widened even more and his expression hardened, filled with rage and helplessness. Without saying a word, he clenched his fist and slammed it into the ground. How many times had that simple request been ignored and trampled upon? That's what he asked himself as he heard the old man insist on making the antidote. The lunatic said she could still be used as material. Showing no kindness in his heart, he got closer and said he'd sell the elf for less than a cow or a horse, and said that if he didn't want her, he'd sell her to someone else. With a despicable smile, he added that he didn't want her to die there in the shop. That's when our hero spoke up, and with great anger, declared that he'd take her with him. Meanwhile, the elf remained still, eyes filled with tears. Touched by such care, after all, this had been the first time someone had ever cared about her. The merchant was shocked, asked if he planned to carry the elf alone, and offered a backpack. Yet our hero, still kneeling, gave a short reply and indicated he'd leave immediately. Next, our hero placed a hood over her to hide her wounds, and gently explained that he'd support her by the torso to prevent her from falling. Under the shadow of the hood, her one healthy eye widened, following his every move, trying to decipher whether this new journey would bring relief or more pain. Watching that restless gaze, Hero silently reflected on how she interpreted it all, fearing that the care would seem like just another form of ownership. Then he secured the straps on the backpack stakes, pulled the knot tight, and adjusted the weight. Once done, the poor man lowered his head, and as he lifted her onto his back, he regretted that she, used to being treated as an object, accepted that transport without complaint. Facing the distant wall, he moved along the dense trail, carrying the elf on his back. Step after step, his boots sank into the rugged terrain, creaking over roots and stones. Even tired, he kept his voice calm, said they'd take a steep shortcut and asked her to hold on, since each detour would save hours. Under the hood, she tilted her head, murmured something nearly inaudible, surprised to receive explanations, something rare in her life of imposed silence. He caught the whisper but said nothing. He simply gave her time. fearing to break the fragile trust starting to form between them. As the sun set, he wiped his forehead, and as the forest darkened, he calculated that, leaving at dawn, they'd reach the city before noon. Exhausted, he stopped near a tree and said they'd rest there for the night. Before letting her go, he carefully raised the hood, removed the thick cloth that covered her, and allowed her skin to breathe while she tried to form broken words, surprised by such attention. Then he took off his backpack, set up a small improvised seat for her, and explained that he'd prepare something warm, asking her to stay put. Soon his attention returned to her. The elf, now sitting under the gentle night breeze, felt the wind move her loose hair and, for the first time in a long while, breathed in the scent of damp leaves without feeling fear. With that, he noticed that her pained expression had softened since they left the city. He thought that elves, used to ancestral forests, might feel calmer among trees. That thought motivated him to always choose greener roots when possible. Soon the smell of hot soup spread through the camp as the broth bubbled in the rustic pot. Crouched beside the fire, our hero tasted the broth, thinking that if it was soft enough, the elf would be able to swallow it without trouble. Meanwhile, the scent of the warm meal reached the elf, who sniffled at the smell. Upon noticing her reaction, he concluded that, despite everything, her sense of smell still worked well. With a wooden spoon, he then scooped some soup and brought it to her. Gently, he brought the spoon to her lips and asked her to eat slowly. She, however, kept her lips closed. Overcoming her distrust, she finally opened her mouth, allowing him to feed her. However, due to weakness and the injuries in her mouth, some soup spilled. Seeing her struggle, our hero quickly asked if she was okay, fearing the food was too hot, but then he stopped yelling and noticed something in her expression. The elf was crying. Meanwhile, she persisted in chewing the soup. With patience, our hero helped her, offering another spoonful, and she, with effort, managed to swallow part of the food. As the spoon neared her mouth again, fresh tears welled up in her eyes. Part of the soup still dripped from her weak mouth, but the pharmacist kept going. Calm and steady, she continued to make a painful effort to chew. Noticing her persistence, our hero gave a faint smile and asked if the soup was good. Then, the elf raised her eyes, answering only with a look. With gentleness, our hero reached out and fed her again. Little by little, the bowl of soup began to empty. With a cloth, our hero gently wiped the stains off her face while saying they should stop there. After the cleaning, the elf looked him in the eyes, and experiencing such kindness, her eyes began to tear up again. Shortly after the night deepened over the forest, the elf, now lying under a blanket, murmured something inaudible. Our hero, noticing that her fever was very high, quickly approached and wondered if it was exhaustion or an inflammation due to all her injuries. However, he considered it might be an infection that had reached her internal organs. Still, he decided that the exact cause didn't matter at that moment. What he needed was to relieve the symptoms, and so he opened his pharmacist's case, determined to prepare an infusion to lower the fever and fight potential infections. Then he began brewing a decoction, carefully using elderflowers and wild borage. Next, he ground a magic stone in a mortar, preparing it to add to the boiling mix. Our hero figured the taste of that medicine on its own would be unbearable for the elf, so he planned to add honey and salt to make it easier to swallow. With the medicine ready, he approached and carefully tried to administer the dose, aware it would be difficult for her, but still insisted, knowing it was necessary. Thus, with great effort, the elf swallowed the spoonful of medicine. Meanwhile, our hero embraced her, telling her to take it slow and steady. Next, he laid her down and expressed hope that the medicine would help her a little. The elf then panted in exhaustion while sweat ran down her face. She continued to breathe heavily, letting out small sighs of fatigue, along with a few scattered words. Seeing that she was starting to speak again, our protagonist widened his eyes and gave a faint smile, assuring her she would surely make it home. Meanwhile, he wiped her forehead with a damp cloth and asked her to rest. The campfire crackled, casting light and warmth over their camp. At a safe distance from the fire, our hero sat while the elf rested beside him. She slept deeply, and her soft breathing showed that she was managing to rest. And looking at her more closely, our hero could only remember the words he had spoken, the promise that she would definitely return home. With that, the poor man wondered if those words had been spoken irresponsibly, considering how serious her condition was. Still, despite the uncertainty, he felt a strong desire inside him to truly help her return to the place she belonged. He regretted that those responsible for her suffering were of his own race, the Irtanos. With that, the poor man reflected on the continent's reality, where the 5 races lived in constant mistrust, a remnant of the war that had happened 80 years before. To him, race was just physical and cultural differences, but he knew most people didn't see it that way, like the pawn shop owner himself, who had treated the elf terribly without even realizing his cruelty. And the worst kind, he thought, were those who didn't even see other races as human beings, only looking down with disdain at all they considered inferior. He kept reflecting, trying to understand why so many still didn't see other races as people. Suddenly his eyes widened, and a wave of feelings seemed to hit him. He felt like countless beings were pulling him down, the cadaverous shadow behind him, him, a reflection of his own demons, seemed to accuse him of being a murderer. Amidst that emotional storm, he saw his hands stained with blood, and his pupils dilated as he saw the person he once had been. With that, more and more skulls appeared around him, calling him a murderer. But in the next moment, he looked at his hands again, and unlike before, now they were clean. With his eyes fixed on his palms, he contemplated them, remembering the things they had once been capable of doing, whether good or bad. Then, the sun finally began to rise between the trees, and with the light interrupting his thoughts, the poor man wondered if all the torment of the night before had been just a nightmare. Soon the elf awakened, and little by little her eyes opened to the light filtering through the trees. Meanwhile, a faint glow seemed to appear in the elf's only visible eye, like a small spark of hope. Beside her, our hero watched her, looking exhausted from the night vigil. Then, he greeted her good morning and said he'd help her sit up. He supported her gently, helping her sit against the tree, and noticed that her fever seemed to have gone down, but warned her they still couldn't let their guard down. The elf in turn kept a distant gaze, seemingly focused on a single thought, the simple and profound desire to return home. With that, our hero thought about how he could make that dream come true. For her to have a life similar to the one she had before, it would take proper treatment and care. However, that would require a lot of time and effort. Suddenly, ghosts from his past came back to haunt him. That dark presence made him lower his head. Even so, even with so many problems and past mistakes, he raised his head again and declared his sincere wish to help her. He admitted he didn't know what kind of person she used to be, only knowing the scars that marked not just her body, but also her heart. Because of that, he came to an important conclusion about his motivations, realizing that he wanted to give her a name full of hope and longing. The only thing he truly wished for her was just one thing. With that, he reached out to the elf, calling her a Razure and expressing his hope that, little by little, she would recover and have a chance to start over. Then, the pharmacist suggested they eat soon so they could continue their journey, as they would reach the workshop that day. Meanwhile, the pot of soup kept bubbling over the fire. Soon he announced the food was ready. The elf in response repeated her new name, and shouting with joy, our protagonist called her to eat. Shortly after, upon arriving at a village, our hero told Razure that this would be the place where she'd live from then on. Inside the house, the pharmacist helped the elf sit on a couch, to which she responded with inaudible grunts. First of all, our hero suggested that they should take a bath, but as he looked at her more closely, he noticed something and said he'd step out for a moment. Next, our hero went to the door of a house and knocked, holding a basket in his hands. At that moment, a little girl greeted him joyfully, asking about the sweets she had requested. However, he apologized, explaining that something urgent had happened, so he hadn't been able to bring them. With that, her neighbors scolded the girl, telling her not to be so selfish. She apologized for bothering him, saying she knew he was tired. Then he revealed that, in fact, he was the one in need of a favor, and asked if she wouldn't mind helping him. The woman, surprised by her sensei's unusual request, showed curiosity. So they talked in front of the door. She handed him a package of her old clothes, explaining that she had chosen pieces easy to adjust to Razure's size. He thanked her kindness, saying that would help a lot, to which she replied that if he needed anything else, he could call her. Meanwhile, smoke kept pouring from our protagonist's chimney. Hot water was pumped into the bathtub. As the room filled with steam, our hero warned that he would wash her body and for that needed to take off her clothes for a moment. Upon hearing that, the elf only let out a grunt. Despite the touch, she showed no other reaction. Even while naked, with a heavy heart, the pharmacist saw the countless scars covering her back and wondered how much she had suffered. Soon, he helped her sit on the edge of the bathtub, and upon seeing that body marked by cruelty, a single tear ran down the pharmacist's face. The scars across her back looked like memories of something terrible. On her neck, bruises revealed the intensity of pressure once applied there, and seeing human finger marks in that spot, intense rage took over him. The poor man expressed his frustration, wondering who could be capable of such cruelty, who could have done that to her. Next, our protagonist wrapped bandages around her burned arms. With the dressings applied, he carried her in his arms and took her to the bedroom. In his mind, only one command echoed: to focus solely on what was strictly necessary, pushing aside anger and sorrow to concentrate on the task ahead. Gently he laid her on the bed, observing the extent of the damage. With that, he decided to first treat the external wounds. With firm fingers, he began the treatment by applying an herbal ointment to the most visible scars. Then he considered covering the area with Coria's medicine to speed up the healing process, combining both remedies for maximum effect. Soon after, he grabbed a piece of special cloth soaked in slime fluid and carefully placed it over the treated area, knowing that substance's properties would help retain moisture and protect the skin. While finishing the bandage application, adjusting it to her body, he mentally calculated that it would need to be changed every 3 days, realizing that Razure's recovery would require a routine of constant and long-term care. With the initial medical treatment completed, he turned to a pile of clothes on the table and asked to dress her. Aiming to offer at least a minimum of comfort and dignity, he then started dressing her in a simple shirt. As he stepped away to get the rest of the garments, he paused for a moment upon noticing something on the table. It was a woman's comb. Holding the item in his hand, he wondered if his neighbor Anne had placed it there as a kind gesture. With a sigh, he picked up the comb and gently began to brush Rizure's long hair. Shortly after, there she was, sitting on a chair, already dressed in clean clothes. The bandages still covered much of her body, but her posture now conveyed a certain dignity. With a fixed gaze, our hero stared at her and thought that maybe it was just his own hypocrisy, but Rizur seemed different. With that, a deep relief swept over him, easing some of the burden he carried on his shoulders. Amid the whirlwind of emotions, he felt the relief give way to fatigue and, with a calmer mind, began to wonder if it wasn't time to eat something before sleep finally overtook him. Shortly after, our hero placed food on the table and apologized for the delay. However, his gaze locked on Rizure. Upon noticing that she was trembling, startled, he approached and asked if she was cold or if the fever had returned. But then it hit him, and he realized the cause of the trembling was something else. She needed to go to the bathroom. With that, he panicked and apologized for not paying attention, and without wasting time, he carried her in his arms to the bathroom, running as fast as he could. While carrying her, he thought about how Rizura, despite always keeping a restrained expression, became visibly embarrassed in moments like that. After taking her to the bathroom, our hero carried her back to the chair, and while feeding her, he concluded that Rizure's sensitivity to physiological needs was still intact. With that, he wondered if eating something delicious would help her open up more. Watching her struggle to eat, he remembered that she only had her molars left, so he pondered the need for dentures to improve her chewing ability. Soon he stated that even if Rizure regained the ability to chew, he would still be worried about the internal damage to her organs and the progression of necrosis in her limbs. With that in mind, the shadow of possible amputation loomed over him, leading him to question whether there really was no other way to save her. In a moment of anguish, he wondered if he should ask for help from that person, a doctor he knew. Faced with that situation, he realized he would do whatever it took for Rizure. Then he carried her in his arms to a place where she could finally rest. Our hero gently laid her on the bed, while the elf slowly closed her eyes. Little by little, the traces of pain on her face softened, and despite her wounds, she now seemed to find a more peaceful sleep. With that, he felt a certain relief because he saw that the elf had finally found a moment of peace. And well, our hero remained there beside the bed, deeply wishing that there was a medicine capable of healing all her injuries, one that could restore her eyes and lost limbs. That's when a spark of an idea seemed to flash in his mind. He remembered a secret elixir, powerful potion capable of physical regeneration. The memory made him reflect on something he'd once heard about truly powerful potions, very different from the exaggerated rumors about a universal elixir made from elves. He thought that, although he didn't have the equipment or knowledge to replicate such a feat immediately, he would try to create a powerful potion capable of healing Rizure's wounds. However, as he looked at her, he thought that perhaps that wasn't the only solution. Thus, he wrote a message and then fed a crow, asking it to take care of the letter for him. The next day, our hero tended to his chores, while Rizure watched him from the veranda. He then informed her that she could call him if she needed anything. Thus, she watched as he walked toward the field. Soon after, he began tilling the soil with his hoe. During that time, he cultivated the ingredients needed for Rizure's medicines, thinking that unless he was away, he couldn't neglect the crops. The breeze moved the treetops while some leaves detached and danced gently through the air. Rizure, from the veranda, deeply inhaled the scent coming from the forest. Then, a tear rolled from her eye as she realized the smell of freedom she was feeling. Suddenly, she formed a few whispered words, comparing that place to her home. Amidst all this, our hero labored in the field, digging the soil with effort. Sweat ran down his face and he wiped it constantly. Soon after, back at home, his door opened, and his neighbor's daughter, little Moan, peeked in with bright eyes and greeted him warmly. He greeted her back, asking if she had come to help with the deliveries, but the little girl, a bit shy, said no. The real reason for her visit was soon revealed when her eyes landed on the figure sitting on the couch. With great excitement, she exclaimed upon confirming that the big sister patient was really there. Our hero then formally introduced her, saying her name was Rizure. Then, driven by curiosity, the little girl turned to the pharmacist and asked for permission to talk to her, which he promptly granted. Our hero, for his part, watched the scene and thought that allowing the interaction could be a positive stimulus for Rizure's recovery. So, little Moan approached and sat beside the elf on the couch. Later, focused on the next steps of the treatment, the pharmacist concentrated on a new task. He opened a book on the table and his hand pointed to a diagram of a dental prosthesis. Analyzing the notes and the necessary tools, he decided to start crafting the dentures for her. Using the documents he had as a reference, he prepared to take another essential step in his patient's long recovery journey. Starting this new treatment phase, our hero focused on his workbench. With a tool in hand, he carefully scraped and shaped a boar's tusk, beginning the process of molding the teeth for Rizure's prosthesis. His full concentration, however, was broken by Moan's persistent voice, calling him from the couch. With that, he looked up and answered the girl's call. With genuine curiosity, the girl looked at the elf beside her and then at him. Wanting to know why Rizure didn't speak, he soon became thoughtful, reflecting on the complexity of the situation and how to explain it in a simple way to the child. He then gave a gentle explanation, saying that maybe his patient was just waiting for the right moment to feel comfortable and start talking. With that, the little girl leaned forward slightly, attentively waiting for her to speak. Suddenly, Moni's face lit up and her eyes sparkled as she had a sudden idea. Immediately, she ran outside. Moments later, Moni returned, calling the pharmacist's attention. With a radiant smile, she presented her creation, a flower crown that she delicately placed on Rizure's head. With a soft smile, our hero looked at it and praised the girl's work, saying it was very pretty and that she had talent. Then, with all her innocence, the little girl declared that Rizure was the uncle's bride, leaving the pharmacist completely speechless. Desperate, he tried to correct the misunderstanding, quickly explaining that she was just a patient there to treat her wounds, but Moan didn't seem to care, replying that he had said himself that she was beautiful. Mission accomplished. The little girl happily said goodbye to Rizura and opened the door to leave. Right after the door slammed shut while the pharmacist stood waving, he then turned and his gaze shifted to the elf. He reflected that healing a wounded heart like hers required small and precious moments like that one. After that joyful moment, the care routine continued. With extreme delicacy, he approached and applied eye drops to the elf's only visible eye. Beside the bed, our hero prepared for another treatment session with his instruments and ointments in hand. Then, he used a stethoscope to listen to her chest. However, the pharmacist wondered whether her heartbeat was too weak, or if maybe her chest's thickness made it harder to hear. Later that night, he finally completed his work in the workshop. With his face partially covered by a mask, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction for the day's efforts. Carefully, he inserted the dentures into her mouth. Despite the elf's initial discomfort, he assessed the fit and concluded that, for now, it would serve its purpose well. With that, he said that starting that night, she would finally be able to brush her teeth. To celebrate the progress, he decided to prepare a special dinner. While a juicy steak, a gift from a cattle rancher, sizzled in the pan, he concluded it would be the perfect meal for the occasion. With the dish ready, he placed it before her. To ease chewing, he had soaked the softest pieces of meat in alcohol and sliced them thinly, ensuring she could eat without difficulty. Then, he skewered one piece with a fork. With a gentle smile, he raised the utensil toward her and invited her to eat. Carefully, he brought the small piece of meat to Rizure's mouth. She then closed her lips, accepting the food. While the elf chewed slowly, he watched her with great anticipation, wondering what she thought. Suddenly, Rizure's eyes widened, and a sigh escaped her lips, a genuine reaction to a flavor she hadn't felt in so long. Seeing that, the pharmacist's eyes filled with tears. Moved to see her for the first time, enjoying a small pleasure, she inhaled the aroma of the meat, savoring the flavor first with her nose. Sensing the intensity of the moment, he reassured her, saying she should eat slowly as this was her first solid meal in a long time. With the same care as before, he offered her another piece of meat. She accepted it, closing her lips around the fork. The soft sound of her chewing, even with effort, was the only thing heard in the quiet room. Suddenly, the poor girl began crying uncontrollably, which made our hero burst into tears as well. With a tender smile, he asked if it tasted good. She accepted another piece with tears still running down her face. Moved, he told her she could eat as much as she wanted. The elf kept crying, overwhelmed by that gesture of kindness. Sitting across from each other, he asked again if it was good. After Monet's visit, he reflected that little by little, Rizure seemed to be recovering her emotions. As he watched her, he noticed a deeper calm surrounding her. He then pondered that perhaps that meant she might start talking again sooner than he had imagined. At that moment, the elf's only visible eye twitched strangely amid its red veins. Days later, while preparing another meal, he noticed with satisfaction that Rizure's appetite had been growing significantly. He then turned toward the living room and called her by name. However, as he suggested they make a stew, an abrupt sound interrupted him. Suddenly, with a thud, Rizure collapsed from the couch, leaving the pharmacist paralyzed. With a face pale with fear, he tried to call out to her. The situation was desperate. On the floor, the elf was convulsing, with blood pouring from her lips. Quickly, he held her in his arms, panicking over what could have happened. As she had seemed stable until that moment, terror consumed his face as he analyzed the situation up close. The poor man quickly identified the symptoms: seizures, redness spreading across her chest, invisible difficulty breathing. Looking at her face, he noticed her eye was completely red. The truth hit him like lightning. These were the symptoms of obsidian spider venom, a potent toxin neurotoxin often used in assassinations. His mind worked fast, trying to understand when she might have been poisoned. He ruled out the villagers as none would know of such venom, and the pawnshop owner didn't seem like someone who'd do something like this. With other possibilities eliminated, one terrible conclusion remained. It could only have been her former owner, the same man who had destroyed her life. With that, panic overwhelmed him, and he ran to his bench, grabbing his herb flasks. Believing it wasn't too late if the venom was still spreading. At that moment, his mind took him back to the pawn shop. He remembered asking the merchant if he had given her anything before they left, and the man nodded in response. The memory became clearer. He saw the man offering a bottle with dark liquid to Razur, who obediently drank it without hesitation. Back in the present, sweat poured down his face as he desperately called her name again. Without wasting time, he laid her on the bed. Determined to make her expel whatever was causing this, he pressed her abdomen firmly, and amid groans of pain, she finally vomited into a basin he held. Examining the contents, something caught his attention. Amidst the liquid, there was a small broken sphere. Using tweezers, he picked up one of the fragments. Noticing it was far too tough for an ordinary pill, more like a cocoon, he then understood it had delayed the venom's effects, which were only now manifesting. Looking more closely, he identified strange symbols engraved on the surface, an ancient language he couldn't recognize. A chill ran down his spine as the horrifying truth struck him. This wasn't just poison. Was a curse. Instinctively, he tried to crush the fragment with the tweezers. At that moment, he realized the truth behind the cruel plan. It was a slow-acting poison, designed so the victim would die far from the person who caused it. The intention was clear and vile, calculated so she would die somewhere far away, no longer able to interfere. With that, a devastating rage took hold of him. This was pure evil, an act of cruelty so deep it twisted his face with hatred. With no other choice, he ran to his neighbor's house for help. Beside the bed, Ani looked at the elf, who panted in pain. Moan cried at seeing her new friend suffer, while her mother, heart-heavy, commented on how much pain she seemed to be in. With his backpack on and ready to leave, our hero explained she had been poisoned by a monster neurotoxin and that he needed to go collect the ingredients for the antidote. Despite her worry, Ane reassured him, saying he could go and that she and Monet would take care of Razure. He apologized for the burden, estimating he'd be back within 3 days. Before leaving, he handed her a paper with instructions for the medicines Razure should take during his absence. With the paper in hand, his neighbor absorbed every detail of the instructions, and he cast one last look back before leaving, then lowered his gaze. With a heavy voice, he asked that, if for some reason he didn't return, or if her condition worsened, they prepare for her burial. Despite the gravity of the request, Anna nodded firmly. As he turned to leave, his reflection was caught in her eyes as she whispered his role in a prayer. Sensing his hesitation, she grabbed his arm, trying to give him strength and saying everything would be okay. She encouraged him to focus on his mission. With a determined look, she promised they would take good care of Razure, and added that the elf herself would stay strong too. With an encouraging smile, Anna said they would wait for his return and that he should leave everything to them. With his face marked by gratitude, he deeply thanked her for the help. Then he turned toward the bed and looked at Razure one last time. With unshakable determination, he promised to save her and asked that she wait for him. Hearing his promise, a few tears rolled down the elf's face. With a heavy heart but focused, he began his journey through the forest. Without rest, he collected the first ingredient, forcefully pulling a mandrake root from the ground. Then, in a cave, he extracted the second essential component, a mana quartz stone, with a pickaxe. And then he continued his path through a dark, gloomy forest, for he knew that to create the antibodies, he needed the most dangerous ingredients, the venom liquid and the liver of a black obsidian spider. He remembered that in the past, even finding those creatures' habitat took days, but now time was a luxury he didn't have. With that in mind, he grabbed his bow and, with an ironic thought, remembered how those old skills, once forgotten, now had value again in the situation. The thought crossed his mind, how long it had been since he'd last wielded a weapon. Despite the time, the feel of the wood and string in his hand still felt oddly familiar. Leaving his backpack at the entrance so it wouldn't hinder him, he entered the cave's darkness. Guided only by a small sphere of light, he walked cautiously through the cavern's interior, the glow from his finger revealing the rocky walls and winding path ahead. Soon he braced himself for what lay ahead. The darkness ahead seemed to thicken, woven with countless webs covering everything. And then, in the midst of that blackness, a subtle glow appeared. As he approached, he saw several cocoons hanging in the webs. The bodies of small animals like rats were wrapped in silk, victims of the spider. Focused, he spotted his target and quickly drew an arrow from his quiver. He pulled the bowstring, aiming precisely. The tension in the bow increased as he prepared to fire. However, hitting a vital spot was difficult as the spider wouldn't stop thrashing. Determined, he told himself that the past no longer mattered, only the present. With that in mind, he drew the bowstring even tighter as the spider turned toward him, baring its menacing fangs. But our protagonist quickly locked his sharp gaze onto the creature, and the arrow shot forward with a powerful hiss. It struck the spider's head with explosive force, spraying dark fluid and forcing it back. As he collected the venom he needed, the image of Rizore's suffering came to mind, fueling his resolve. However, the vision of a fallen body, a memory of a past failure, tried to shake his confidence. He remembered a power that once flowed from his hands. Then another arrow flew, hitting the creature which, though wounded, remained a threat. Without hesitation, he continued launching a volley of arrows. Meanwhile, he grew irritated by that insistent voice reminding him of how skilled he used to be. The creature's very presence seemed to mock his lack of training and audacity. Still, he pushed those thoughts aside, reaffirming that the past didn't matter now. The image of Rizure at her most vulnerable appeared in his mind, and an inner voice reminded him to channel all his strength to help her. The memory of her agony, vomiting, and pain became the final fuel for his determination. With a cry that echoed through the cavern, he invoked a powerful magic, and a glowing circle of energy formed at the tip of his arrow. Now, imbued with overwhelming energy, the arrow shone brightly. The magical projectile cut through the darkness, flying like a beam of light toward the spider. The impact was devastating, and the arrow struck the creature with multiple hits that echoed through the cave. Without giving it a chance to recover, he continued the assault, launching a blast of energy from his bow. Struck full force by the overwhelming magic, the creature finally collapsed. With the battle over, he approached the spider, and, with effort, collected what he needed into a small vial, thus completing his mission in that cave. With his face dirty and weary, he held the bag with the ingredients, stating that all of it was for Rizure. Soon after, he prepared the antidote, squeezing the liquid from the spider's leg into a container. Monet watched from the doorway, silently praying for Rizure to hold on just a bit longer. He then injected the antidote into her shoulder. Gently, he assured her she would get better, and asked her to hang in there just a little more. Then, night fell over his home. Sitting beside the bed, he watched Rizure's restless sleep, waiting for a sign of improvement. The elf panted, sweat pouring down her face, still under the venom's effects. He sighed, his face showing fatigue and deep concern. However, her breathing began to steady slightly, and a small sigh escaped her lips as the redness in her chest began to fade. The pharmacist's attentive eyes missed no detail, analyzing every small change in her condition. As the hours passed, he held her hand and felt that the hardest part was finally over. He gently squeezed her bandaged hand, whispering that everything would be okay. With his face marked by exhaustion and emotion, he repeated the promise. Meanwhile, Rizorde heard his voice calling her. In her mind, the elf saw herself in a dark and empty place, surrounded by thorny black vines. Those vines, the manifestation of the curse, were reflected in her eye. Her body was wrapped in that darkness, pulling her into an abyss of despair. But in the midst of the darkness, a light appeared, and the voice of her savior reached her. Calling her back, the glowing hand extended toward her, and his voice repeated the promise that everything would be okay. The reflection of that hand shone in her eye, an image of hope fighting against the dark vines of the curse. Suddenly, awakening from that nightmare, her eyes opened, and tears began to form, marking her return from the brink of death. By her side, the pharmacist watched her, and upon realizing she had woken up, he called her by name. With visible effort, she tried to form her first words. Seeing her speak, his eyes widened. Her only eye was now clear, and a tear slowly rolled down. He leaned over her, asking if she could see him. With a weak voice, she replied that she couldn't, but somehow she knew he was there. With that, cold sweat ran down the pharmacist's face, while pure happiness overtook him as he realized she was truly speaking to him. One thought echoed in his mind, a sigh of pure joy that she had survived. He then pulled himself together and asked if he could help her sit up to examine her, to which she gave a barely audible nod. As he helped her up, he was surprised to feel slight muscle movement from her, a small but meaningful sign of recovery. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he examined her neck and noted that the fever had subsided, and the redness in her chest had disappeared, indicating the poison seemed to be gone. He then observed her eye more closely, and although vision had not returned, he noticed a pupil reaction to light, a sign her functions were returning. In his mind, he theorized that perhaps the stimulating effect of the mandrake, combined with the reverse action of the magic stone, had not only neutralized the poison, but also restarted the regeneration process in the damaged area. A solitary tear then formed at the corner of her eye, slowly sliding down her face. The small gesture caught him by surprise, and the pharmacist's eyes widened. Soon after, she began to move on her own, prompting him to ask, concerned, if she was okay or in pain. Ignoring the question, she looked at him and, with a weak voice, asked if Rizurde was her name. Surprised by the question, he confirmed it, explaining that, not knowing her real name, he had given her that nickname. Gently, he said she could tell him her real name if she wanted, but, with a lost and melancholic look, she replied that she didn't remember anymore. The revelation left him speechless. Knowing that, he lowered his gaze. In his mind, he wondered if it was a case of retrograde amnesia, caused by the trauma she had suffered. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he pondered how he could help her return home. Since elves were a migratory people and their habitats were unknown, despite the new obstacle, he looked at her with determination, thinking he had to find a way for Razure to one day return home. While lost in thought, her weak voice called him. Emotionally, she thanked him for saving her, which left him momentarily speechless. After hearing that, he closed his eyes and denied it, saying there was no reason for pessimism. The sincere gaze, he promised to take care of her. She nodded, accepting his promise. The next day, Anne came to visit, expressing her joy at seeing her well. With a smile, she offered to make a cake to celebrate her recovery and asked if Razure liked sweets. Monet, beside her, cheered at the idea, while Razure, with a small smile, confirmed she liked sweets. Seeing that, the pharmacist offered to help, but Anne and Monet insisted he sit down and rest. Scolding him, his neighbor remarked that he was always losing sleep, and Monet pointed out he had huge dark circles. He touched his own face, asking if he looked that bad, and both replied with a loud, "Yes." Aine explained that with Razure finally awake, it would be a disaster if he passed out from exhaustion. She then handed him a mug with a warm drink and said that everyone needs help sometimes, insisting that he leave it to her. Accepting the mug, he thanked her and said he'd accept her offer, while Annie, with a thumbs up, promised she could handle it. And well, after a long, hectic period, he finally allowed himself a moment of rest. While he rested, the scene unfolding before him was one of comforting peace. Sitting at the table, Moan chatted cheerfully with Razure. For the first time since she arrived, a small and genuine smile formed on the elf's lips. Our hero watched the interaction with a deep sense of satisfaction. However, that scene of acceptance and affection brought forth a painful memory, and his gaze drifted to a dark past. He saw himself again as a boy. In the memory, he ran desperately, panting and with panic on his face. Suddenly, a strong hand grabbed him by the collar, and an adult voice accused him of stealing something. Then, other men approached yelling, making it clear he wouldn't be protected just for being a child, and told him to stay away from the village if he wanted to avoid bigger trouble. Even the other children joined in the cruelty, throwing stones and shouting for him to go away. Defenseless, our hero remained kneeling in the hail of stones, facing the cruelest people he'd ever known. With a bruised body and broken spirit, the boy finally stood up and walked away silently, leaving behind the village that had rejected him. He wandered aimlessly until he found shelter under the shadow of a large tree, where he sat, hugging his knees in an attempt to protect himself from the world. His face, marked by bruises and dust, reflected pure desolation, an abandonment no child should endure. His eyes, tired and swollen, carried the weight of the cruelty he had suffered. Suddenly, the shadow of a pair of boots appeared in his field of vision, and he slowly raised his head. His eyes widened in surprise upon seeing that unexpected figure. He looked up and saw a pair of imposing horns. A huge figure crouched before him and, with a surprisingly gentle voice, asked why he was alone and said he looked hungry. The man then extended a hand in a gesture of compassion, inviting him to come along and promising food. The boy's eyes, once empty and lifeless, now sparkled with a fragile glimmer of hope. Soon our hero accepted the hand offered to him, the man's large, calloused hand wrapped around his own small, fragile one in a touch that promised safety. A little later, the boy held a bowl of hot, steaming stew. Sitting on a log near the fire, the man watched silently as the boy finally ate. With a hunger that seemed endless, the boy devoured the food. With a calm voice, the man advised him to eat slowly. With a genuine smile, the man asked if it was good. Then, the memory faded and, back in the present, Moan's voice drew the pharmacist's attention. With a fork, she offered Razure a piece of cake. Then, the little girl asked if it was good. With a look of pure happiness, Razure confirmed, saying it was sweet and delicious. Her reaction deeply moved him, and his face took on a melancholic expression. That scene transported him back to the past, and he remembered himself as a boy with tears streaming down his face. The intensity of that memory was reflected in his eyes. Back in the present, Annie's laughter broke the silence. She commented, satisfied, that seeing the happiness on Razure's face made all the effort worthwhile. He then reflected that indeed, he had once been exactly like her. In his mind, he saw a strong parallel between past and present. Lowering his head, he acknowledged that he was only alive because of someone else's kindness. Suddenly, the flight of a black crow approaching the window broke his train of thought. The bird landed on the windowsill and tapped its beak on the glass, drawing his attention. The unexpected sound startled him, pulling him abruptly from his deep memories. On the windowsill, the crow had left a small rolled-up scroll sealed with wax. Annie asked what it was, and the pharmacist explained it seemed to be a reply from an old friend. He had asked for help with Rizure's case. He then opened the message and his pupils quickly dilated at what he read. The letter stated that the sender hadn't examined an elf's body in a long time. He read that despite interest in the case, his friend, blunt as always, also asked about payment, making him reflect on how unchanged his personality was. Despite the rudeness, the content of the letter was crucial. With that, he turned to his friends and said he needed that specialist to examine the necrosis spreading in Rezure's body, because he feared that without his friend's help, the only option left would be to amputate the elf's arms and legs. Thus, a new journey began. In the distance, the pharmacist walked along a dirt road, informing them that they would travel north to visit his friend. He soon explained to Rizure that the first step was to cross the forest to reach the city of Karuga, where they would use a teleportation portal to reach their northern destination quickly. As they moved forward, he revealed one last detail, saying that he had placed a necklace on her. He then explained the function of the ornament, detailing that if she infused a bit of her magical power into it, the object could be used to send a distress signal. However, the pharmacist said he didn't expect them to get separated, but since the journey would be long, it was good for her to keep that in mind, just as a precaution. With that, the elf agreed. They then continued their journey. At a certain point, the terrain became rougher. While being carried, she called out to him, breaking the silence with a timid murmur. Worried, she apologized, asking if she wasn't too heavy, but with a gentle smile, our hero reassured her, explaining that he was used to carrying lots of ingredients on his back, so her weight was actually lighter than normal for him. Hearing his comforting response, the elf's expression softened. As night fell, the pharmacist announced that they would camp there until dawn. Soon, he set up the camp with the fire crackling and the meal already served in 2 bowls. They sat in silence, facing each other, under the firelight that illuminated the forest's darkness. With a distant gaze, he reflected that now that she could finally speak, he didn't quite know what to say. However, it was Rizure who broke the silence, calling him with a timid murmur. She then asked what his name was. The question caught him off guard, and he seemed to ponder that unexpected matter. Meanwhile, the elf stared at him with her single eye, patiently waiting for a response. Visibly unsettled, he averted his gaze and a cold sweat ran down his face. The mere mention of his own name seemed to stir a deep internal conflict. After a moment of hesitation, he finally answered, saying she could simply call him pharmacist. Soon after, her face lit up with a genuine smile, reflecting the sincere joy she felt at meeting the one she now called pharmacist. Seeing her reaction, visible relief washed over his face. However, in his thoughts, he reaffirmed that it had been the right decision. He reflected there was no need for her to know much about him. With that, a shadowy image appeared in his mind, where he saw himself imprisoned by his past, which made him believe he had no right to share his story with anyone. His focus then returned to the elf, and he decided that his only priority was her safety, completing her treatment, and finally taking her home. Suddenly, a loud and sharp sound broke the camp's silence. Instantly, he went on alert and grabbed his knife. Instinctively, he moved into a defensive stance in front of Rizure, shielding her from the approaching threat. From the darkness of the night, a giant paw with sharp claws emerged. It was a colossal bear stepping out of the shadows, its fierce gaze locked onto them, or rather it was a king grizzly bear, which made the pharmacist visibly tense. He knew how wild and dangerous those animals became before hibernation, and thought that if he were alone, it wouldn't be much of a problem. However, upon looking at Rizure, he realized it would be difficult to escape with her. The beast then let out a deafening roar that echoed through the forest, baring its threatening fangs. The creature's terrifying cry made the elf curl up in fear. Faced with the imminent danger, the pharmacist stepped forward, realizing he had no other choice. As he prepared to fight, a soft and unexpected melody filled the air. The song came from Rizure. The bear, once ready to attack, was enveloped by the musical notes, and its rage began to subside. The beast's expression softened completely, and a deep calm replaced the aggression in its eyes. The pharmacist remained on guard between them, totally confused by the animal's sudden change in behavior. With a gentle smile, Rizure reassured him, saying everything would be fine. Completely pacified, the huge bear gazed into the distance, mesmerized by the song. Then, the creature turned and slowly walked back into the forest's darkness, leaving them in peace. Shocked, the pharmacist looked at the elf, linking that extraordinary power to her race. He then turned to her and, still surprised, asked if she could talk to animals. However, the elf wasn't sure, but she seemed to believe the bear had been afraid. In disbelief, our hero questioned how a creature of that size could feel fear. Regardless, he knelt and thanked her, admitting her intervention had been a great help. With a shy smile, the elf seemed pleased to have been useful in that moment of danger. He then looked toward the direction where the bear had disappeared, still trying to understand how a king grizzly bear could be so frightened. With that, his mind wondered what else could be in that dark forest, capable of scaring such a powerful beast. The situation reminded him of a moment before departure, when he found himself in trouble under the disapproving gaze of his neighbors. One of them had asked about Razure's clothes for the northern journey, and he had replied that he had some extras, not thinking much of the consequences. The result was that the elf now wore winter clothes that were too big and heavy, which was becoming a big problem. Anae pointed out that his clothes were far too large for her, and he agreed that he'd have to go to the city to buy something that fit, to which she suggested he also buy the undergarments. And that was the story behind the outfits. Soon after, the pharmacist found himself inside a women's clothing store, feeling completely out of place while the employees looked at him suspiciously. He thought the situation was even more tense than the battle in the obsidian spider's nest, but he stayed focused on his goal of buying winter and underclothing for Razur. Awkwardly, he approached a saleswoman and admitted he didn't know how to judge clothing sizes. Seeing his awkwardness, the woman asked if he was buying the items for himself. Panicking, he denied it, embarrassed, explaining the clothes were for his sick sister. The saleswoman complimented his kindness, but her suspicion was obvious when she asked what exactly was wrong with his sister. He tried to explain that she wasn't in good condition, and that's why he was shopping for her. The woman's suspicion only grew, and she pressed further, asking which part of the body his sister had issues with. Cornered, he answered that she had many bad parts, and that basically her whole body was debilitated. That vague response convinced the saleswoman he was a terrible liar, and she finally asked how old this sister of his was. Pressed, he started to say she was probably younger, but then remembered the longevity of elves and corrected himself, wondering if maybe she was actually older. His hesitation only confirmed the clerk's suspicions that none of his story was true. The result of that trip to the store, however, was seen on the day of departure, when Razure, wearing her new and proper clothes, thanked the pharmacist shyly while being fussed over by Aine and Mona. Aine congratulated him on the successful purchase, but he couldn't forget the suspicious looks from the store staff. Back in the present, that memory faded. The pharmacist noticed that although nothing had seemed strange until that morning, the forest was now far too quiet, with no signs of animal life. He looked around with apprehension and concluded that something was very wrong with that place. As he thought it best to cross the area as quickly as possible, Razure's voice called out to him urgently. With her eye wide with fear, she warned that something was coming their way. The warning made him stop abruptly, digging his feet into the trail. He held his breath and heightened his senses, trying to identify the threat moving through the forest's eerie stillness. He then turned to Razure and asked if she could sense where the threat was coming from, to which she replied that she couldn't, but she felt it was something very large. With fear written on her face, she added that she had a terrible feeling. Suddenly, a sudden movement ahead caught the pharmacist's attention. A massive serpentine shadow flashed across the trail, leaving a trail on the ground. From the trees, a gigantic serpent rose, its immense body looming over them. Faced with the sight, the pharmacist finally understood the reason behind the bear's earlier fear. He looked into the creature's eye and identified it as a mutant variant. Realizing that the serpent had already spotted them, he concluded there was no other choice but to fight. Wasting no time, he grabbed a small vial he kept for emergencies and quickly drank a strengthening potion. Ready for battle, he asked Razure to wait there for a moment while he handled the situation. With knife in hand, he activated a spell called Taruma, which made the blade vibrate with powerful energy, increasing its cutting ability. Then, the pharmacist and the serpent faced each other. The creature hissed threateningly while he stared back with full focus, like our hero Deadpool. From a distance, Razura watched everything with wide eyes, terrified of what was about to happen. The serpent then charged with impressive speed, but the pharmacist stood firm. In a move of astonishing agility, he leapt and ran along the serpent's massive body, using it as a path to get closer to its weak spot. With a shout, he landed a precise strike, and the vibrating blade sliced through the serpent's head scales, spilling blood. Hit by the attack, the creature recoiled. Without giving the beast a second to recover, he landed and sprinted across the clearing, preparing for the next move. However, the serpent retaliated with a devastating tail strike that tore open the ground. He managed to dodge just in time. Taking advantage of the opportunity, he leapt again toward the creature's body, and with a shout, he drove the knife with all his strength into the serpent's back, piercing its thick scales. The creature hissed in agony, writhing violently, but he held firm atop the beast's body. However, in a desperate move, the serpent's tail struck him directly. The blow injured his hand, which bled around the knife's handle. Enraged, the serpent lunged with its jaws wide open, ready to devour him. He then activated a new spell, and a glowing circle of of power shone brightly in his hand. With a swift and precise motion, he released the accumulated energy in a powerful upward slash. The arc of light struck the serpent's head, cleaving it in half with devastating force. The creature's body exploded in a shower of blood, and he landed just behind it. With the battle finally over, he fell to his knees, panting, completely exhausted from the superhuman effort. After a moment, he got up and, still out of breath, wiped the knife with a cloth. His injured hand still gripped the knife handle tightly. He then turned to Rizuri and apologized for taking so long to return to her side. With her face still pale with fear, she called out to him. Kneeling beside her, he reassured her, saying the danger had passed and that, had they left the creature alive, it might have attacked nearby villages. However, the elf was still trembling. He then looked at his injured hand and, though it didn't seem serious, decided it was best to use an antidote just in case. At that moment, Rizure broke the silence, calling out to him hesitantly. With her eyes fixed on his hand, she asked, worried, if the wound would be okay. Trying to reassure her, he downplayed the injury, saying it was just a scratch and suggested they keep going, as their destination didn't seem too far now. Relieved by his answer, she agreed, while a faint smile appeared on her face.